Okay, well, I think it's always just worth taking a step back periodically and reminding ourselves what the book of Ecclesiastes is all about. It's actually all about this question of meaning. How can I live a meaningful life? Not just a life that feels meaningful, but a life that is actually meaningful, that actually lines up with the way the world is. Now, it's a huge question, isn't it? The meaning of life. And actually, it's a question that's been being asked for centuries. And one thing we've learned in all those centuries is that it's a much easier question to ask than it is to answer. In fact, it has proven so difficult to answer that as a culture, we've all but given up even asking it. We've become so cynical about the possibility that there is an answer to the question of the meaning of life, that we've begun to wonder whether the question itself is actually meaningful. Now, look, in these videos over the last few weeks, we looked at the idea that when you strip away the possibility of meaning, that what that actually creates is a huge tendency to despair. Philosophically, it's called nihilism. It's the idea that if there's no meaning, then nothing matters. There's no point. And actually, how dangerous that is, not just for us personally, but actually for us as a society and a culture, because that creates a vacuum in which people become very vulnerable to exploitation and abuse. Because, if nothing matters, if there's no consequence, if nothing has any meaning, then it doesn't matter how I live, and it doesn't matter how I treat other people. Right? That's a really dangerous alternative to what Solomon is exploring in the book of Ecclesiastes. But we need to be honest, and we need to recognize that there are at least two other alternatives that have been put on the table. Okay, you got what Solomon's discussing in the book of Ecclesiastes. You've got the kind of nihilism that I think we all agree that's not where we want to end up. But there are these two other alternatives that are on the table, and we need to be honest, and we need to face up to those and explore them a little bit. And that's what I want to do in this video. All right, now, the first of those other alternatives is the idea that the fact that there is no meaning is actually a really liberating thing. All right, there are people who argue that the fact that everything is meaninglessness is just something that we need to embrace and enjoy and lean into. Philosophically, you'll find this really pushed in the writings of a guy called Albert Camus, who was a French philosopher from sort of the early to the mid 20th century. Now, Camus gets the fact that if there is no God, then really life has no meaning. It has no actual purpose. But Camus doesn't want to end up in the despair that he knew that could so easily bring. And so he really argues for the idea that if life doesn't have any meaning, that's fine. That's a good thing, right? That doesn't have to lead to a crisis. For Camus, what it can lead to is a joyful entering into sort of moral and political liberty, or some might say moral and political anarchy. Part of this, you got to remember that Camus is working in the context of totalitarianism, the different totalitarianisms, fascism and communism that characterized so much of that period of the 20th century. And he's reacting very much against that. He doesn't like that. He doesn't want that. Although when you think about it, it's kind of hard to see what grounds he has to challenge it, apart from the fact that he doesn't like it and he sees it as impinging on the freedom that he thinks he should be able to enjoy because life has no meaning and nothing else really matters. Right? He wants to be able to live life without consequence. Now, at a personal level, the birds came home to roost for him when his long-suffering wife had a nervous breakdown and had to be hospitalized because Camus had a whole number of affairs, at least one of which became very, very public. And it turns out, Camus, that actually how we live does have consequences. And that's the thing, isn't it? The idea that life without meaning, that would be so great, because if nothing matters, then we're free to do what we want without consequence, without guilt, without shame. It's one of those ideas that sounds great in a philosopher's study, or it sounds really appealing in a lecture room to a bunch of 18-year-old philosophy students. Actually, it is a world away from the reality of life. And when anyone actually tries to live like that, they will end up damaging themselves and damaging everyone around them. Right? That's just the way it works. Okay, so we can, I think we can say, Calmus, thank you for the idea that life without meaning is absurd, but that's okay. We should embrace that, and I think we can say no. That the world that creates is anarchy, and that's a bad thing. All right, but there is one other idea that's on the table, and this is an idea that I think you'll recognize very, very quickly, because it's the idea that I think grips our culture. It's one of the working assumptions of kind of Western democracy, liberal democracy that we're living in and trying to work out our discipleship in the context of. And it's the idea that, you know what, you need to stop trying to be so consistent in your thinking and in your life. And what you actually need to do is recognize, on the one hand, okay, there is no objective meaning. But what that does is it gives us space to create our own sense of meaning, our own sense of purpose. Now, this is such a compelling idea in our world that actually you'll find it even on the lips of such a powerful thinker as Richard Dawkins. Now, Dawkins, he's one of the most sort of famous and militant atheists in our culture today. And he argues that there's something actually really childish and infantile about trusting someone outside of ourselves to give us meaning. And his point is that what we need to accept that life only has meaning in as much as we ourselves give it. It only becomes, he actually says, life only becomes as meaningful and as wonderful as we make it. So here's a quote from Richard Dawkins. They say to me, he's talking about people who challenge him and critique him. And he said, they say to me, how can you bear to be alive if everything is so cold and empty and pointless? Well, at an academic level, I think it is. But that doesn't mean you can live your life like that. Do you see the point? Such a telling quote. He accepts that he has to live inconsistently. You see, Dawkins, on the one hand, he wants to assert that life has no actual meaning. But on the other hand, he wants to be able to live as if it did. All right, he recognizes that if we allow the meaninglessness of life to press in on us, we are going to end up in serious trouble. So he goes on to suggest that we can invent meaning for ourselves. Our life is what we make it. Now, even if we can do that successfully, and I don't think we can, I don't think you could ever really trust a meaning to life that you knew you had just made up. Right? So I don't think we can do that. But if you could deceive yourself that completely, if you could con yourself that completely, that you could give yourself to living life, knowing that there was no meaning, but knowing that you had created this meaning and you were going to lean into that as if that is the way the world really was. If we could deceive ourselves that completely, even then, we would know that we were doing that against the backdrop of a world that didn't have meaning. Now, Dawkins is a powerful thinker and he is a very compelling speaker. No one denies that. But I want to suggest to you that actually there's a real cruelty to this idea that we can make up our own meaning, that we can create our own purpose and our own identity. We're told there are no limits. We can forge any meaning we want. We can have we can create our own purpose, we can create our own identity, we can give ourselves whatever meaning we want. That's the ethos of our era. And it holds that if we organize society well enough, then everyone can be whatever they like, and they can find meaning in whatever they want. Now, I want to suggest that actually this is devastatingly naive, and it is hugely damaging for us as a culture, but also for us as individuals. And again, there's a real irony about this because, like Camus, it's presented as something that's really liberating. This is the path of freedom. The idea of looking to God is seen as repressive and dangerous and limiting our potential. Whereas this, we get to define ourselves. This is so wonderful. This allows us to really flourish and grow into everything that we would want to be. Actually, the opposite is true. Freedom is found in being the person God has created us to be, living in a way that resonates with what God has created us to be. To leave people to forge their own purpose, their own identity, their own meaning. I mean, that crushes people. We can't bear the weight of that responsibility. And I don't think it's an accident that the culture that celebrates the freedom to create our own meaning is a culture that is seeing an endemic proportion of mental health issues, especially amongst children who are being taught this relentlessly in our schools. How different to hear Jesus come alongside us and say, look, my burden is light. Let me deal with those issues of meaning and purpose. I give this world meaning. I give this world purpose. I give you meaning. I give you purpose. All you need to do is deal with me. Your significance, your purpose, your meaning in life, all of that can be a gift from me. And that is real, genuine liberty.